we are right back in the saddle this morning. JD Green with you. 45 degrees and sunny in the Granite City. Rory Thibault, our Washington County State's Attorney, is right next to me this morning. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm so glad to have you back. And it was a couple of months ago, I think we had you in the hot seat here, and it's wonderful that you're back, and we appreciate it so much. What's happening with the landscape with our judiciary system right now? With we could say everywhere, we could say nationally, but with result of COVID, Franklin County. We had a Superior Court judge who basically, in layman's terms here, just said, look, our backlog is overwhelming us. We just simply don't have the time to deal with every single one of these cases. So we've got to dismiss them. Am I right here, in layman's terms?
Yeah, so courts throughout Vermont have been hit in an uneven level by the pandemic. And, if you could rewind 18 months ago before this all started, each county had a different level of backlog or of cases pending. And that can be driven by a number of things, judicial rotations, just gridlock of cases going on, what have you. So when the courts were shut down for, the better part of several months altogether before we could get back to doing virtual court or, appearing remotely, it was like a traffic jam, and sometimes it takes a long time to clear that up. And Franklin County was hit really hard by a number of factors. And, one important one, if you want to look at it as a storm, the flood was exacerbated by the judiciary rollout of its own case management software. That would have been disruptive under the best of circumstances. And in Franklin County... Pre-pandemic. So it started rolling out, and it continued to roll out during the pandemic, which just created... another layer of delay in the process. And, one thing I will say, Judge Maley, who issued that order up in Franklin County, took stock of that, didn't just blame the defense counsel or the prosecutors, but rather, recognized that really all three part players in the judicial game of prosecution, defense, and the courts had a role to play in creating that backlog.
We're going to obviously ask about Washington County and what's happening here, but how do you do that? How do you say, all right, this stuff over here, let's separate this out. This stuff over here, we're going to dismiss. This stuff here, we might dismiss. We need to examine it a little bit further. And this stuff over here, absolutely not.
So Franklin County, when the 350 or so cases that they're looking at are really ones where the victim, if you will, would be the state, not a person. So it's things like violations of conditions of release, the driving license suspended. And, you have to take a question. Is it really worth pursuing if someone had 3.5 years ago or 4 years ago in some cases of driving with a suspended license violation and hasn't been seen in court since? Mm-hmm. What's the interest in going forward on that versus prioritizing some new violent crime or a case with a victim? If there's only 8 hours in the day in which court time can be used in Franklin County or in Washington County or wherever, and I think that in Franklin they took stock that they need to make sure that those most important cases are getting pushed through and that they're not wasting time on old historic cases that don't have a meaningful impact on public safety.
Do you think that this is possibly given the wrong message to society?
Yeah, I think there's, the moral hazard here is if you just delay and wait long enough, maybe your case will go away. Right. And, I don't think that's what's being sent by what happened up there. And it's certainly not circumstance of a lot of other counties, and particularly not Washington County.
Yeah. You wrote here, and I'm quoting, and I'm going to quote some of this because it's very good. The situation in Franklin County provides a good backdrop to conduct a wellness check on the health of the criminal justice system in Washington County. In my view, the system is not just the courts, the prosecutors, and defense counsel. Rather, it includes stakeholders like the law enforcement, the Department of Corrections, Department of Children and Families, court diversion and community justice centers, and treatment providers working with offenders. From a broad perspective, the system is doing well relative to other regions in the state, but significant challenges remain.
Right.
And one of those is that, we just don't have a long line of future police officers tripping over themselves waiting to get into law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's fairly well documented at this point that statewide, nationally too, but statewide, Vermont is really struggling, and that's been also made worse by the Vermont Police Academy had to take significant actions to mitigate COVID spread among its participants, and so the class sizes have been reduced. And so even if I've heard this from different law enforcement stakeholders, even if they could get or find an applicant who's qualified now, it's looking at 9 months to a year before they're actually in that role. And meanwhile, people continue to retire, people continue to take jobs out of state, and it's really difficult for our law enforcement partners right now to meet their basic missions.
The big question here is, with all of these cases being dismissed in Franklin County and other counties, what about Washington County? What's the situation? You say that even before the pandemic, frankly, Washington County was in pretty darn good shape with being able to handle the number of cases. So going into this storm, we were generally pretty healthy. Washington County.
Right. Yeah, and I know you've had other guests on the show who've probably sung the praises of Judge Morrissey. So we had an unusual circumstance where Judge Morrissey is here for 3 years. Typically, judicial rotation is a year or 2 years, but because of her role in the treatment court and the pandemic, she ended up being here for 3, which I think was a huge boost. It meant that unlike other counties that had a judge rotate out before 6 months before the pandemic and took that time to catch up on what cases they had, we never had that interruption. We kept moving along, and if nothing else, she held the prosecution and defense counsel's feet to the fire. If you weren't making progress on a case, you were in front of the judge explaining why aren't you trial ready? Why isn't this motion been filed? Deadlines would be set, and put it this way: the expectation is with any court, you don't want to miss a deadline or disappoint somebody. And with Judge Morrissey, that was especially acute because much as she was warm and affable, you did not want to not comply with one of her orders. And so I think that really kept everybody within the system doing their best and knowing that the expectation and culture was get your job done in the time you can. And that's why we went into the pandemic, I think, in a healthy state. The stability from the court. That's also
Washington County Court Diversion Program.
Yep. So our court diversion program, I think, is amazing. And I can't speak to other areas of the state, but they kept working throughout the pandemic. So just because the pandemic occurred, they rapidly moved to doing things virtually by phone and following up. And, the diversion program in Washington County is one of the great unsung heroes of our judicial system. And they really do a fantastic job working with people on lower level offenses.
Yeah. You say that you, here in Washington County, that you adopted a mindset in case negotiations, informally referred to as the COVID discount. What's that all about?
So in the beginning part of the pandemic and still to today, there's immense reluctance. No one ever wants to sign up for a sentence that involves jail or incarceration. Let's just face it. No one wants to go into St. J or the Chittenden County Correctional Facility for Women. Nobody signs up and wants to go there. So if sticking with business as usual during the pandemic, one, there's the health consequence, which sometimes these facilities were on complete lockdown and were not taking anyone in. We had corrections actively saying that they preferred to have less people in concentrated environments. So throughout the judiciary, there was really, at least in Washington County, there was a huge effort to look at where do people need to be, what do we need to do? And we took a tact of, rather than sit and wait and hope we get the sentence we want 10 months, 12 months, 2 years down the road, take immediate action. I'm a firm believer that rapid intervention is the best way to hit at criminal risk.
Wow. What about the folks that say or think or have expressed on social media that Washington County has been too easy, too lenient on a lot of these offenders? What do you have to say about that?
It's tough. We take a look at everything case by case, and there's big differences where there's actual victims in a case versus where, again, the victim is, let's say, the state or the government. And risk is dynamic, and it changes.
Yeah.
But I think it's difficult, it's sometimes difficult to stick by even put the pandemic aside. It's just difficult sometimes to look at the outcome or what you're getting in a case under the traditional lens when we're
subjectively.
When we're dealing with substance abuse. Does sitting in jail really hit or address the underlying mental health or triggers for why someone's using? Probably not. Our best resources are in the community, not in our prisons, especially when we're dealing with a lower or moderate risk band. And to that end, I made reference on there of looking at our partners in corrections and community providers throughout the pandemic as well. The Montpelier and Barrie CJCs with their COSA program, so providing housers to individuals reintegrating, they kept humming along as if there was no pandemic. Their job was infinitely harder because face-to-face was tough and there weren't necessarily a lot of places to put people. But everybody kept working hard, and that's why I say when looking at the overall wellness, we started with really great people, and those really great people shone through under a really trying time.
Yeah, big time. You did take a good, careful look. I'm imagining you had to, of some of these older cases that have been sitting around in the books for quite a while, and reviewing them and having to make the decision. Do we really need to go forward with this?
Sure. Yeah, and so we did voluntarily look at our old case. We didn't have a lot, but we looked back at our oldest cases in 2018 and 2019. And, when you scratch below the surface, some people had moved from the state and were long gone. And, we're not probably going to spend the $3,000 to extradite somebody from California for driving with a suspended license offense. We found, unfortunately, some defendants had died in the time that their cases had been pending. So, we went through and voluntarily tried to take a hard look at what cases didn't need to be in front of us anymore.
Yeah. You talk about the level of fatigue with so many of our services, in and around Washington County. They're all being tapped, all of them.
Right.
My goodness, I can't think of one that's not being tapped right now. They're exhausted, and many of them are not putting in 40 hours a week, but a lot more than that.
Absolutely. I think the group I probably feel worst for right now is our partners in the Department for Children and Families. The caseworkers and social workers are just overwhelmed with the caseload that they have, and we think it's difficult to do a Zoom meeting. Try doing a Zoom meeting with, a family that is going through coaching or trying to work towards a plan for reunification with their kids. It's incredibly difficult, and they are underappreciated, under-resourced, under the best of circumstances. And I think the last 18 months have been hell for a lot of those folks.
Department of Corrections.
Yeah, and I think DOC. A lot of focus during the pandemic has been on what's going on in the jails, and there's been a lot of criticism when they've had outbreaks. But to be honest, I think DOC responded in an effective way to try to do everything they could to mitigate. And DOC has been very active in trying to encourage states' attorneys and the courts, don't send people here unless they need to be here. And that may sound odd, but that's not from hey, we don't want to do our job. It's out of the function that the more people come and go, the more risk there is of exposure to COVID or quarantine or just chaos for them. At the ground level here, the probation and parole officers, they didn't just get to wipe their hands away because it's everyone's on lockdown. If anything, it became infinitely more difficult for them to to supervise and work with people. And I think a lot of them watched with horror as folks relapsed or went down a not great path when their traditional supports melted away. And I think if I take a lesson about anything from the pandemic, particularly when looking at substance use and substance use disorder, it's the importance of people. The human connection of going and seeing a counselor, of being accountable to somebody in person, is much different than doing a group in a Zoom chat. And I really hope that, if nothing else, that those are the services that come back stronger when all said and done.
There are so many services. We've had in here just recently the Central Vermont Prevention Coalition, which we understand is, for lack of a better term, is just trying to consolidate all of these services into a main hub. But there are so many services and opportunities in different directions you can be pointed into to better your life, so you're making better personal decisions, so that you don't end up meeting you.
Right.
I mean, it's a big umbrella. They're doing a great job, and we try to bang that drum for them and promote the great things that they're doing. But man, there's tall order right now.
Absolutely.
What is this adjustment or justice reinvestment to?
Mm-hmm. So justice reinvestment has been a long process here in the state of Vermont. At its core, it's a partnership between the Center for State Government, or CSG, along with different stakeholders here in Vermont. Justice Reinvestment 1 was years and years ago. But Justice Reinvestment 2 has been implemented and rolled out over the last few years here in Vermont, and it really is trying to transform why people are in jail and ultimately looking to reduce Vermont's prison population. It's no secret that we spend a lot of money sending Vermonters out of state to places like Mississippi because we don't have capacity here.
That's right.
And I think what gets lost in that is, there can be debate about the private prisons, everything else, but just on a human level, do you think those folks in Mississippi have a routine opportunity to see their family? No. Right. So it's just fundamentally, and a lot of them are, they're on long-term sentences. It's just a really different, and there's no way to put it. It's not an ideal setting.
Yeah.
At the same time, Vermont's prison infrastructure is really dated. Our facilities, save for a few, many of our facilities are incredibly old. Marble Valley, the Chittenden County Regional Facility, and Northeast Regional Correctional Complex up in St. Jay. They're legacy facilities that were designed at a different time where you're holding a lot of people for very short-term periods of time, not long-term.
Right.
So,
and Newport too.
Yeah, Newport. And, sadly, I think Newport and Northwest are viewed as, the more modern and better facilities. And yet they could have improvements as well in terms of being places that are geared more towards rehabilitation versus just being places that are incapacitating people from the community.
Yeah.
So that underlies a lot of why our state government is looking at justice reinvestment. It's, the idea is that the money that's saved by housing less Vermonters in prison can be put back into community resources. So with that, there's been growing pains for sure. Justice reinvestment, I think everyone can agree that on the policy end and on the idea end, it is I think most stakeholders would agree, well, you should be doing all those things. Mm-hmm. It's, of course, the implementation, and there's now that sort of gap or divide between being able to realize those cost savings and put them back into the community versus maybe having to, buffer some more risk in the community before we get there.
I see on social media the hashtag raise the age. Everywhere. Yeah. What is this all about? What happened? Maybe a month and a half or two months ago. There was maybe it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
There was it was just flooded the media. It was everywhere, and everyone has got an opinion about this. What is this all about?
Well, so I want to back up and say that they're two really similar, but really different efforts underway. So juvenile justice reform has been a hot topic in the legislature now for the last 4 years. And I think people often confuse the discussion of raise the age with the expansion of youthful offender laws. And there's a big difference between the two, and I think it's important. So I want to start with just raise the age.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize this. Right now, if you're an 18-year-old, save for the worst of the worst offenses, you are going to be referred and cited into family court, not criminal court. So that was effective last July 1st. 18-year-olds became treated as juveniles for purposes of justice in Vermont. Next year, on July 1st, 2022, 19-year-olds are due to be treated as juveniles.
That's right.
As well.
How do you feel about that? What say you?
For the most part, it is effective and it works when we're looking at lower risk crimes. And it's the typical kids being kids things you can think of, misdemeanor possession of drugs, unlawful mischief or vandalism, or, being loud or disorderly. In the past, some of these small misdemeanor offenses could cripple somebody for years. It meant that they couldn't apply to colleges, meant they couldn't get a job. So keeping that confidential in the criminal division was another reason why, as I mentioned before, youthful offender law was expanded, trying to give people the opportunity not to be bearing the scarlet letter of a conviction that early in their adult life.
There's discussion about the human brain and how it develops, and whether or not it's fully developed between the age span of 18, say, to 25 or 26 years old. But there's also folks that are very opinionated about that say, don't point the finger at that. Old school accountability, and get your ass handed to you instead of a slap on the wrist. This is a big deal in Vermont.
Well, it is, and I don't know when exactly my brain stopped developing. I do know that as I'm pushing 40, it's going in the opposite direction, where I'm forgetting things a lot more and tired all the time. But not to make light of it, I think that the friction is this. I think where the rubber meets the road and where people are upset are when we're dealing with high-risk cases, and it's something I feel strongly about as well. When we have, let's say a 20-year-old committing a sex assault on a campus, should they have the ability to go in the youthful offender track and in a confidential proceeding in family court where the public and victim don't get to see to the full extent what happens, that there are not the collateral consequences of a conviction if we get there. So it's really, I think there's much less disagreement about the little offenses. There's a lot of disagreement about the big offenses. And I look at it from, the legislature is going to do what it's going to do. And as a prosecutor, I can have my policy opinion, but at the end of the day, I need to make sense and navigate the system that we have. And part of that, to me, or where my hesitation comes in, is looking at who can provide the best services or supervision. And I think that Youthful Offender and Raise the Age have pushed the Department for Children and Families to take on a portfolio of risk and need that they haven't traditionally dealt with. When we're dealing with a 15 or 16-year-old juvenile who goes out and commits a horrible crime, let's say a stabbing or an ag assault, DCF has a number of tools. They have residences under their control that they can refer children to. They have sometimes, family placement where actually the child remains placed and stable in their home with a safety plan. Once we're dealing with 18, 19, 20-year-olds, these are kids that or not really kids, young adults, I should say, that have left the nest in a lot of cases. We're fortunate here in Washington County. If you haven't talked to the folks at Return House, you should at some point. Marianne Owen runs an amazing program over there. And, thankfully in the past year, their contract has been changed to allow for placement by both the Department for Children and Families and by DOC. But we had to be 2 years into that process for that to happen. And that's a huge part of mitigating risk, is making sure that these individuals have a safe place where they're held accountable and live by rules and have some structure. I think DCF struggles mightily to supervise, 18 or 19-year-olds that don't have a family-based support, that don't have a stable residence or stable, living situation. And that's where I feel, the Department of Corrections may be more, appropriate for that. And that's not to say that DOC can't and shouldn't be involved in these cases. They frequently are. But it's really who has primary responsibility for that person. And we've continued to keep this sort of wall in place or divide that if it's, a family division case, then DCF's in charge. And if it's criminal division, then it's, DOC. And my main concern at the end of the day is who has the best resources and the best wherewithal to make sure that whatever that person's being supervised for doesn't happen again, that victims remain safe, and that they actually, make strides and progress towards doing something better with their life. And, I'll just say generally, I think the fruits of this have been good. At its best, the people going through both Raise the Age and Youthful Offender have really not been seen or heard. In a lot of cases, have been some really great intervention. But again, what I started with, that all comes back to the people who are doing this. It's the quality of service providers. And I'll say as state's attorney here, I'm really spoiled. I am incredibly spoiled to have such great community partners doing this work. But Washington County is a resource-dense area of the state. There are other rural areas that do not have the same opportunities or advantages that we have, just as much as people living in the center of the community here in Barre, Montpelier, Berlin have great access. That access becomes a lot more difficult when you're dealing with 18 or 19-year-olds without cars that are living out in Woodbury or in Roxbury or in Warren or in Waitsfield.
We'll and I know you've already alluded to this, but we'll raise the age. You're saying that's going to be going up to age 19 this coming summer?
It is, although I'll note that some stakeholders in juvenile justice group have asked that the legislature consider a pause or holding off on that to give more time for resources and systems to catch up
Yes.
with that.
There was a lot of chatter about that in the media maybe a month or two ago.
Right.
Will this alleviate some stress for these resource agencies in and around Washington County?
I think for the Department for Children and Families, absolutely. They are, as I mentioned before, their primary mission of child safety and assisting in child welfare, at least in that part. I know they have economic service, a lot of other important divisions too, but at least when we're looking at the family division, I think they have their work cut out for them with what they have. And not to say that there's a lot of 19-year-olds that would be added into the mix, but in aggregate, that's just another stress added to a system that's already nearing its breaking point.
We have chatted quite a bit here on the podcast. We love to share success stories. We also love to have folks come in here who have really been in the trenches. Right in front of you is this beautiful table made by Eric Miller, who graduated from treatment court not long ago, and he started his own business and is just flourishing. He's doing so well. How is treatment court going? How's the success of it right now?
It's always, as a system, it can be tough to look at and judge, is it doing well, is it not doing well? Because I think frequently we get caught up looking at how individuals in the program are doing. And some months we'll have a spurt of people graduating. Other months we have a group that are not doing well and are there for termination hearings out of the program. And I can say this: I'm a big fan of it. One of the things I appreciate more than anything else is it does break down these barriers. While we have still ethical boundaries, what we can and can't do, it's difficult as practitioner not to sit there and start rooting for people. There's a lot of time spent in court sitting around, and one of the sanctions, I don't know if others have mentioned this, one of the sanctions that individuals in the program will get was courtroom observation. Mm-hmm. So we'll frequently have treatment court, folks sitting there taking notes and kind of holding court while we're holding court, and in between breaks, it's a good chance to get to hear and learn about people. And when there's dead time in court, the judges are apt to ask questions. Hey, what's going on? How is this going? How's that? And it breaks down, I think, that barrier of the adversarial system and allows us to really look at, the person in front of us, not the case number, not the criminal, not the offender. It's the person. And, treatment court succeeds in doing a lot of good things, of pushing people, I think, towards sobriety, one. But two, really, that what underlies all that is trying to engage in more, constructive behavior, getting a job, getting stable housing. All these things that are predicate to maintaining a recovery. And so I will say this, during the pandemic, treatment court had a huge amount of hiccups. I think like across the whole region, the disruption to day-to-day life pushed some people who were in recovery or on a rocky road of recovery back into use.
That's right.
And it took a while to recover from that. And, I will say that here, like I said, it's a mixed bag. I mean, we had a lot of graduations last spring and over the summer. And then at the end of the summer, we also had the treatment team and the participants devastated by 2 overdose deaths among participants.
Yeah. What's the most prosecuted offense in Washington County? One of our listeners asking that right now on Facebook.
Oh, that's tough to say. In a usual year, we will file anywhere between about, it's varied, anywhere between 1,400 to about 1,700 criminal cases. You opened the show talking about the challenge in law enforcement. One thing that I've seen a lot less of has been the typical traffic enforcement. Vermont State Police and other departments have had to really prioritize responding to, general crimes. So there's been much less of that sort of passive enforcement, and likewise during the pandemic there was a desire not to interact with the public unless absolutely necessary. So traffic enforcement and proactive drug enforcement are 2 of the areas that you saw the biggest decrease in cases. But in a regular year, driving offenses would be a big chunk of what we'd see, anywhere between 300 to 350 DUI cases, and then probably a few hundred driving license suspended cases, maybe 100 or so of those as well, separate from that. This past year, the script has sort of been flipped, where there's been, and I'll give context to this. In the past, when we'd have a DUI case, maybe a third of them would involve some sort of, motor vehicle accident or collision or hitting a guardrail or hitting another car, hitting a parked car, something like that drew the law enforcement response. And then 2/3 would be from proactive. It was someone who's speeding, proactive enforcement would be someone who's speeding, or just officers would be out and about and see someone weaving, in the lane and then conduct a stop. That is flipped, where I would say almost 2/3 of the cases we have coming in now are ones in which there are, some sort of motor vehicle fault or incident that results in law enforcement response, versus a third of them being the ones where it's, the guy, officer out there with the radar gun. So that might be indicative, and I think there's less cases overall coming in that class. But as a single offense, that would be it. I can break down some other offenses. Unfortunately, 18 months ago at the beginning of the pandemic, I was lamenting the fact that we seemed to have a surge during the initial lockdown of domestic violence cases in Washington County.
Sure.
That, I don't want to say that the normal level is ever good, but we got back to a more normal rate of cases coming in the county over time. But if you tally up violations of abuse prevention order and actual domestic assaults, felony and misdemeanor, that usually accounts for between 110 to about 130 cases a year. And then those are cases too where we'll sometimes track with them the violations of conditions of release for contacting a victim or doing other things like that afterwards. So we have
There's been an uptick in that?
We've been stable this year so far from what I've been tracking, but last year was an above average year.
Wow. And I know that we've thrown some love at our municipal and state police, but man, we can't do it enough. I mean, they're just, the hours that they're putting in, they're wearing many different hats now. These forces are just they've had a lot of stress put on them.
Yeah, and I think in the absence, what occurs a lot, and Montpelier in particular is dealing with this with their revised response protocol for mental health calls. In the past, I think it's a healthy step to start getting police out of some things that they ought not to be primary on. But
Yes.
In a lot of cases, law enforcement or the justice system becomes a system of last resort when just nothing else, seems to work or no one else can respond. And I think the most challenging calls that I hear about from my partners in law enforcement are frequently ones that never come across my desk, because there are these, crisis situations centered around, mental health and need. And and talk about another system and a partner I haven't mentioned yet. Washington County Mental Health Services is this huge umbrella that covers really the entirety of the community. And I know that they've struggled to keep their positions filled and
Sure.
to keep everything running to the best they can during the pandemic. And the services they provide and support they provide is amazing. And that's probably a good segue too to say that I think probably the one bright spot I've seen in law enforcement the last few months in terms of structural change and things has been the addition of Susan Lemaire as an embedded worker from Washington County Mental Health with the Berry City and Montpelier Police Department. I think she's learned a lot from the law enforcement partners, and likewise, I think they've learned a lot from her. And I've been able to see firsthand her ability to work with people on calls and in the aftermath of tragedies that have occurred here in the county.
Yeah. We're chatting with Washington County State's Attorney Rory Thibault this morning, just kind of recapping a general wellness check, as you put it, for Washington County with our judicial system in light of what's recently taken place in Franklin County, where fair to say thousands of cases were
No, about 350 or so.
350?
Yeah.
Boy, I was way off.
I think thousands are being looked at, but it's the trencher 350 that seemed to be.
Rayleigh, don't laugh at me. 350 cases dismissed, tossed out.
Yeah.
In Washington County is doing so well comparatively, but again, this I think there's some concern that this might be setting some sort of precedent that. Hey, you can be crazy right now, and you're probably not going to do any time because the courts are too busy. They're too taxed right now as it is.
Well, I think one thing that would counter that locally, and it's important to know. Last week, one of my deputies concluded the fourth contested jury trial since the courts reopened, and that's a sign of a healthy system. We're proceeding to trial, and I don't know if you've ever been in the Barry courtroom. I'm sure some listeners have. Not much has changed in that room since the 1980s. There's beautiful carpeted walls and some wood paneling that has seen better days. But it's a functional courtroom, and fortunate for us, it had a just good enough ventilation system where we can have jury trials in there. And knock on Eric Miller's wood here.
Yes.
We have not had any concerns or claims that anyone got sick or ill or exposed to COVID during the course of it, which is validation that the judiciary's protocols for COVID mitigation have been working.
Yeah.
And again, it shows that we're open for business. And I'm not sure how many. I know other counties have had jury trials as well. I think we've been consistent in having them, just about every month and every opportunity that we can. Judge Griffin, who's our judge who rotated in now, I'll put it this way, I've never had so many, as we call them, evidentiary hearings. I've never had so many as I've had in about the last 60 days.
Wow.
And that's, contested motion hearings on admissibility of evidence at trial. It's, doing, bail reviews. It's contested sentencing arguments. It's these things that require a lot of time, and the fact that we're getting those in and getting them done again is indicative to me that we're on the right track. And a lot of that credit goes to the judges' leadership of wanting to get this done, and also our judiciary staff. I mean, they're working just as hard as everyone else to make sure that these cases keep moving, because at the end of the day, if things aren't docketed, the judge isn't doing anything.
Right. Great testament to them. I can't even imagine how many hours are being put in by these fine folks. I just can't even imagine. Thanks for coming in here.
Yeah, no, my pleasure too.
This was wonderful to read this. It's wonderful to sit with you and chat about this. I'd love to have you back in here maybe late winter, early spring, and maybe do this again and see where we are. A lot can change in a short period of time. But are you willing to do that?
Yeah, I can. And, there's, aside from tidal wave going on, here, I expect there's going to be a lot to talk about in the spring, especially when the legislature reconvenes. You mentioned before, changes to raise the age and whatnot, and then also,
yes,
I'd encourage listeners to take a hard look at the CSG report on racial disparities in the justice system that came out last week.
Where do we find it?
Ooh, I have it in my email, but
I'll find it.
Yeah,
we'll find it. We'll link it up.
So there was testimony taken by the legislature. Senator Sears, as the head of Senate Judiciary, is integral to the CSG study of Vermont and efforts. But a lot of recommendations in there, and I'll just say that as part of that, I sit on the Vermont State Sentencing Commission, and in that role, and also taking stock of what's in that report. I've referred recommendation to lawmakers about some reforms to our drug laws, and keep doing work to help combat the problem, because when you see the disparities, there's just no way to describe it other than appalling. And, it gets difficult to explain why that is when, what is it in aggregate decision-making going on all throughout the state by different judges, different prosecutors, by different defense counsel interjecting. There's so many different things, and yet the end result is unmistakable. And so I think we take a lot of stock in Vermont of being a place that's committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and yet our numbers don't really bear that out. So I think in my profession as a prosecutor, we have a lot of reflection to do. And likewise, I think we have to take a hard look at where we can and should change the laws to, one, be fair, and then two, continue to get to a justice system that reflects the values that we actually, hold here in Vermont. And I think increasingly we can't just say that we believe in values. We need to demonstrate what we're doing to support them.
Wow. So well said. Wow. And we are so lucky to have you here in Washington County. Washington County, our whole justice system, we are so blessed to have you. Our state's attorney, Rory Thibault for Washington County, thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll see you in the winter.
We appreciate it so much. Appreciate all your time. And thanks to our sponsors, Green Mountain Mulch, Fecto Homes, Salvador and Babbitt, the Central Vermont Chamber of Commerce, Barry Area Development, FGB Theaters, Gustos, CW Creative, Vermont Custom Woodworking, ASB Financial, Barry Montpelier Times Argus, Donnybrook Fight Promotion, Wright Electric, Gothier's Quality Grounds and Maintenance, Preston's Kia, Granite City MMA, and Barslow Construction.